Carl Jung discovered the most dangerous thought pattern that keeps you trapped. And the terrifying part is that it feels like clarity. If you've ever convinced yourself that this is just how I am, if you've rationalized why change is impossible for you specifically, if you've built an entire identity around your limitations, you're experiencing what Jung called psychic imprisonment, and it's the single pattern that prevents more transformation than any external obstacle ever could. Jung identified why this thought pattern is so seductive, how it masquerades as self-awareness, and the exact technique he used to break patients free from decades of self-imposed limitation. The pattern reveals itself in one specific phrase you probably use regularly, and recognizing it is the first step to freedom. In 1920, Jung treated a man, we'll call him Wilhelm, who came to therapy with what seemed like unusual self-awareness. At 42, Wilhelm could describe his problems with remarkable precision. "I'm not good with people," Wilhelm explained. "I've always been socially awkward. It's just my nature. My father was the same way. It's genetic, probably. I've accepted this about myself." Wilhelm had a good job as an accountant, lived alone, had no close relationships, and described himself as content with solitude. He came to Jung not because he wanted to change, but because his doctor suggested therapy might help with his chronic headaches. Jung listened carefully, then asked a simple question. "When did you decide this was your nature?" Wilhelm looked confused. "I didn't decide. It's just who I am. I've always been this way." Jung pressed. "Always? You were born socially awkward?" "Well, no, but by age 7 or 8, definitely. I remember being the quiet kid, in class." "And between birth and age 7? Wilhelm paused. He'd never considered this. I don't remember being different, but I must have been this way." Jung recognized what he was dealing with. Wilhelm had crystallized an identity around a limitation, then spent 35 years gathering evidence to prove it was unchangeable. This is what I call psychic imprisonment. When you mistake a pattern for an identity, a habit for a nature, and a choice made long ago for an unchangeable fact about who you are. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying prison is one we build ourselves and then forget we built. We become the guard and the prisoner simultaneously, convinced the door was always locked." Modern psychology now has a term for this: crystallized self-concept. Dr. Carol Dweck's research on fixed versus growth mindset shows that people who believe their traits are unchangeable perform worse, avoid challenges, and experience higher rates of depression than those who believe traits can develop. But here's what makes this pattern truly dangerous. It doesn't feel like a prison. It feels like self-knowledge. Wilhelm wasn't denying a problem. He'd accepted it. He'd come to terms with his nature. This acceptance felt like wisdom, but it was actually the bars of his cage. Neuroscience reveals why this pattern is so seductive. Dr. Bruce Wexler's research shows that the brain prioritizes consistency over accuracy. Once you form a self-concept, your brain actively filters information to confirm it. You literally stop noticing evidence that contradicts your crystallized identity. Wilhelm had spent 35 years noticing every social interaction that confirmed his awkwardness while unconsciously dismissing hundreds of interactions where he connected just fine. If you've ever said, "This is just who I am," about something you secretly wish was different, comment, "I crystallized," because what feels like self-acceptance is actually the most dangerous thought pattern Jung ever documented, and it operates through 4 specific mechanisms that keep you trapped. Jung identified 4 ways this thought pattern operates. Most people use 2 to 3 of these mechanisms. If you recognize all 4, you're experiencing full psychic imprisonment. Wilhelm's first mechanism was identity fusion. merging a pattern with self-concept so completely that changing the pattern feels like self-destruction. He didn't say, "I have social anxiety." He said, "I am socially awkward." The difference is critical. Having anxiety is a condition. Being awkward is an identity. When pattern becomes identity, change becomes existential threat. If Wilhelm became socially confident, who would he be? He'd literally lose his sense of self. Historical example. Friedrich Nietzsche spent years identifying as a sick genius. His letters reveal how he'd fused his physical illness with his intellectual identity. He wrote, "My sickness has made me who I am. Without it, I would be common." When his health improved briefly in 1882, Nietzsche experienced severe identity crisis. He wrote to a friend, "I feel I am losing myself. The suffering defined me, and without it, I am hollow." This is the terror of identity fusion. You'd rather keep the limitation than face the void of not knowing who you'd be without it. Research on identity and change confirms this pattern. Dr. Dan McAdams' work on narrative identity shows that people construct life stories where their limitations become central characters. Removing the limitation threatens the entire narrative coherence. Wilhelm had built his whole life story around being the awkward one. His solitude wasn't failure, it was honoring his nature. His lack of relationships wasn't loneliness, it was not needing what others need. Every limitation had been reframed as a personality trait. When integrated, you recognize patterns as something you're experiencing, not something you are. I'm experiencing social anxiety creates possibility. I am socially awkward creates prison. Without integration, every pattern hardens into identity. You become a collection of limitations defended as authenticity. Change feels like betrayal of self. Wilhelm's second mechanism was relentless evidence gathering to prove his crystallized identity was fact, not choice. "I've tried being social," he told Jung. "It never works. I have decades of evidence." Jung asked him to describe one attempt. Wilhelm recalled a dinner party from 15 years earlier, where he'd felt awkward and left early. "See, I tried. It's not for me." One dinner party, 15 years ago. This was his evidence that change was impossible. This is how evidence gathering works. Your brain becomes a lawyer, defending your crystallized identity. You collect every confirming instance while dismissing contradicting ones as anomalies. When Jung pushed further, Wilhelm revealed hundreds of social interactions that went fine. Conversations with colleagues, friendly exchanges with neighbors, a pleasant chat with a stranger on a train. But none of these counted as evidence because they contradicted his identity. Psychologists call this confirmation bias in self-concept. You're not objectively evaluating your capabilities. You're prosecuting a case to prove what you already believe. Without integration, you become an expert at proving your own limitations. Every attempt that doesn't go perfectly becomes evidence that change is impossible. Every success gets explained away as luck, exception, or not really me. But the third mechanism Wilhelm used was comparative crystallization, accepting that others can change while maintaining that you specifically cannot. "Some people are naturally social," Wilhelm explained. "Good for them, but that's not who I am. We're all different." This is the most insidious form of the pattern because it sounds like wisdom. You're not saying change is impossible for everyone, just for you specifically. You've carved out a special category where normal rules don't apply. Jung encountered this constantly. Patients would read about successful therapy cases and say, "That's wonderful for them, but my situation is different. My trauma is deeper. My nature is more fixed. My circumstances are more limiting." There's always a reason why the general possibility of change doesn't apply to your specific case. Arthur Schopenhauer demonstrated this pattern in his philosophical work. He argued that free will was an illusion and character was unchangeable, then spent his entire life deliberately cultivating specific traits and habits. He believed change was possible, just not for fundamental character, which he'd conveniently defined as unchangeable. You see multiple futures simultaneously when you think about this pattern. Other people can develop new skills, overcome limitations, transform their lives. But somehow, you're the exception. Integrated. You recognize that if change is possible for humans, it's possible for you. You're not a separate species operating under different psychological laws. Unintegrated. You create a special category for yourself, where possibility exists for everyone except you. This feels humble, but it's actually the ultimate arrogance, believing you're so uniquely limited that normal human capacity for change doesn't apply. 3 more mechanisms complete the pattern. Temporal distortion. You claim, "I've always been this way," even when the pattern E started at a specific time. Wilhelm became naturally awkward at age 7, but he talks about it as if he was born that way. Biological attribution. You claim it's genetic, neurological, or chemical to make it feel unchangeable. "My father was awkward. My brain is wired this way. It's just my chemistry." False acceptance. You frame your crystallized limitation as self-acceptance or knowing yourself, which makes challenging it feel like self-rejection. Future projection. You extend your current pattern infinitely forward. "I'll always be this way. In 20 years, I'll still be alone. This is my life." If you recognize 5 or more of these mechanisms operating in your thoughts about yourself, you're experiencing the full psychic imprisonment pattern. If you've used any version of "others can change, but I can't because," comment, "I'm the exception." Because recognizing these mechanisms is critical, but understanding why intelligent people fall into this pattern reveals something even more important. Over the next 6 months, Jung worked with Wilhelm and observed something unexpected. The more intelligent and self-aware his patients were, the more sophisticated their psychic prisons became. Wilhelm's path into imprisonment had started with real self-observation. At age 7, he noticed he felt uncomfortable in groups. This was accurate perception. He did feel uncomfortable. But then he made a critical error. He upgraded that feeling into a fact about his nature. "I feel uncomfortable in groups" became "I am uncomfortable in groups" became "I am not a social person" became "I am fundamentally incapable of connection." Each step felt like increasing self-knowledge. He was being honest with himself. He was accepting reality. But actually, he was building a prison and decorating it to look like wisdom. The pattern accelerated when Wilhelm started reading psychology. He learned about introversion, about temperament, about individual differences. He thought, "Finally, scientific proof that I'm just built differently." He never noticed that introversion doesn't mean incapable of connection. He'd taken a valid concept and weaponized it against his own possibility. Jung wrote, "The thinking man is most in danger of psychic imprisonment because he can build philosophical justifications for his cage. He doesn't just lock the door, he writes treatises proving the door was never unlocked." This is why intelligent people often stay trapped longer. You don't just believe your limitations, you can prove them. You build complex arguments. You cite research. You create entire frameworks explaining why change is impossible for you specifically. Wilhelm had become an expert on his own impossibility. He could spend hours explaining exactly why he couldn't. Change, complete with childhood examples, biological theories, and philosophical justifications. His prison had a library. Because heightened self-awareness can become a trap, therefore Jung developed integration techniques that dismantle the prison from the inside. Jung's approach to breaking psychic imprisonment works through progressive destabilization of the crystallized identity. The first step, locate when the pattern became an identity. Jung had Wilhelm trace his social awkwardness backward. not just remembering instances, but finding the exact moment when a feeling became a fact. Wilhelm discovered it happened during a school presentation at age 8. He'd stammered, children laughed, and he'd thought, "I'm not good at this." That thought, in that moment, became the foundation stone of 34 years of crystallized identity. The technique, write your crystallized identity statement. I am limitation. Then excavate. When did I first think this? What specific event triggered it? What was I feeling in that moment? What decision did I make about myself? Wilhelm realized, I'm not good at this, was an 8-year-old's interpretation of one embarrassing moment. It wasn't a fact about his nature. It was a decision made by a child who didn't want to feel that pain again. Jung had Wilhelm keep a daily log, but with a twist. He could only record instances that contradicted his crystallized identity. This was excruciating for Wilhelm. His brain wanted to record confirmations. But Jung insisted, "You've spent 34 years gathering evidence for the prosecution. Now gather evidence for the defense." Within 2 weeks, Wilhelm had documented 12 comfortable conversations with colleagues. 3 times he'd made people laugh. 5 instances where people sought his opinion. 1 invitation to lunch that he'd actually enjoyed. None of this fit. His identity as fundamentally awkward. His brain had been filtering these experiences as irrelevant. By month 3, Wilhelm had a notebook full of contradictions. His crystallized identity was cracking. As Wilhelm practiced temporal excavation and evidence reversal, Jung introduced 2 final elements. He had Wilhelm practice what I call experimental identity, acting as if the crystallized identity wasn't fixed, just for specific bounded situations. Not forever, just for 1 lunch with a colleague, just for 1 hour at a gathering. Wilhelm resisted intensely. That's not authentic. That's pretending to be someone I'm not. Jung pushed back. You're pretending to be someone you decided you were at age 8. Why is that pretending more authentic than this experiment? This reframe shook Wilhelm's entire framework. His crystallized identity wasn't more real. It was just more familiar. The experimental identity wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about testing whether the limitation was as fixed as he believed. Wilhelm started small. 1 conversation where he didn't pre-label himself as awkward. Then 1 social event where he showed up without his identity armor. Then 1 week where he suspended his certainty about his nature. Each experiment revealed the same thing. His nature was actually a habit, a very old habit, heavily defended, but still just a habit. By month 9, Wilhelm described a completely different life. He'd joined a chess club. He'd reconnected with an old friend. He'd gone on 3 dates. 1 went poorly, 2 went well. The transformation wasn't that Wilhelm became extroverted. It was that he stopped being imprisoned by a decision his 8-year-old self had made during 1 painful moment. If you're ready to excavate, when you crystallized your limitation instead of defending it as nature, comment, I'm ready to excavate. But breaking psychic imprisonment requires 1 final element that addresses why people resist this work, even when they consciously want change. The real reason psychic imprisonment persists isn't that you can't change. It's that change requires what Jung called identity death, and your psyche will do anything to avoid it. 6 months into his work with Jung, Wilhelm experienced a crisis. He'd made significant progress, but then he hit a wall. He told Jung, if I'm not the awkward loner, who am I? My whole life makes sense because of this. Without it, everything I've done for 34 years looks like waste. This is identity death fear. The terror that changing your limitation means your entire previous life was a mistake. If Wilhelm could have been social all along, then he wasted decades alone. If his awkwardness was a choice, not a nature, then he can't forgive himself for choosing it. Better to keep the prison than face the grief of wasted time. Jung recognized this immediately because he'd experienced it himself during his own crisis. When he realized aspects of his identity were constructed rather than inherent, he wrote, "I felt I was dying while still living. Everything I thought was solid revealed itself as smoke." The practice of compassionate reconstruction. Jung taught Wilhelm a critical reframe. You're not discovering you wasted your life. You're discovering you survived it using the best tools you had. At 8 years old, deciding you were not social protected you from repeated pain. That decision served you. It's just no longer serving you now. This reframe changes everything. You're not wrong for crystallizing. You crystallized to survive. The pattern was adaptive once. It's just maladaptive now. The integration milestone comes when you can hold both truths. That limitation protected me when I needed protection. That limitation imprisons me now that I need expansion. Wilhelm learned to honor his younger self's decision while making a different decision now. His 8-year-old self wasn't wrong. He was scared and doing his best. But his 42-year-old self had different resources and could make different choices. Signs you're successfully breaking psychic imprisonment. You catch yourself saying, "I am limitation," and correct it to, "I'm experiencing pattern." You notice evidence that contradicts your crystallized identity instead of filtering it out. You can experiment with different behaviors without it feeling like betrayal of self. You feel grief about lost time, but also compassion for why you needed the protection. You recognize your limitations as patterns, not nature, changeable, not fixed. 1 year after beginning this work, Wilhelm told Jung, "I still prefer smaller gatherings to large parties. I still need alone time, but now I know that's a preference, not a prison. I can choose solitude when I want it, rather than being exiled there by a decision I made when I was 8. The final integration. Psychic imprisonment isn't about having limitations. It's about mistaking patterns for identity, habits for nature, and old decisions for unchangeable facts. The most dangerous thought pattern isn't, "I have a problem." It's, "This is just who I am." Because I have a problem invites solutions. "This is who I am" closes the door. Your crystallized identity feels like self-knowledge, but it's actually self-limitation. It feels like acceptance, but it's actually resignation. It feels like wisdom, but it's actually a cage you've decorated with justifications. You're not trapped by your nature. You're trapped by a decision about your nature that you made so long ago you forgot you made it. Jung spent his career showing people that what they thought was their unchangeable self was actually a pattern they could transform. The work isn't easy. It requires identity, death, grief, and reconstruction. But the alternative is spending your entire life imprisoned by a thought an earlier version of you had during a painful moment they didn't have tools to process. Your limitations aren't lying to you about what you've experienced. They're lying to you about what you're capable of. The question isn't whether you have patterns. The question is, will you let a pattern become your prison? Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.